At exactly 1 a.m., the National Australia Bank goes offline. For 2 hours, the main servers are asleep, the safety checks are disabled, and the ATMs enter a sort of zombie mode called stand-in processing. In 2011, a bartender named Dan Saunders found this window. He figured out he could use a regular ATM card and a glitch that allowed him to withdraw money that didn't exist. And over the course of 4 months, Dan exploited this flaw to print $1.6 million. Now, usually when someone steals $1 million, they have some sort of plan. They have passports, somewhere to flee to, and crypto wallets. But our friend Dan, well, he didn't have any. Dan was a bored 29-year-old bartender who stumbled onto the greatest software bug in banking history, and he decided to see how far he could push it before the feds showed up. But how did a bartender find a flaw in the system of a national bank? Well, to find the glitch, Dan had to be in the right place at the right time with the right mindset. The place was Wangaratta, a small town 3 hours north of Melbourne. The time was just after midnight, and the state of mind was extremely drunk. Dan was out with his friends having a good time, but he ran into the classic problem. The bar was open, but he didn't have any beer money left. So he goes to the ATM to check his balance. He has $0 in his savings, but he has his credit account linked to the card. Now, Dan knows he has no money in credit either, but he's drunk and hopeful, so he attempts to transfer $200 from his credit account to his savings. He presses the button, he waits, and the machine thinks for a moment. Then the screen flashes a message, transaction canceled, and it spits out the card. Now usually canceled means failed, you have no money, go home. But Dan decides to check his balance one more time, just to be sure that there's no extra money hiding somewhere. He puts the card back in, he checks his savings, and suddenly the screen shows a balance of $200. Wait, the transaction canceled. The machine said it didn't work, but the money is there. Dan withdraws the cash. The machine spits out 4 crisp $50 notes. He walks back to the bar, buys a round for everyone, and wonders if he's going crazy. So a little bit later, he goes back to the ATM and tries it again. Transfer $200. Canceled. Check balance. Money is there, withdraw. He didn't know it yet, but Dan had just stumbled into the gap between the ATM and the bank. So to understand how this is possible, we have to look at the ISO 8583 payment protocol. Under normal conditions, an ATM is just a dumb terminal. It doesn't have any authority. When you request a transfer, the ATM sends a packet to the core ledger asking for permission. The core checks your balance, deducts the funds, and sends back an approval token. The ATM simply obeys the token. But at 1 a.m., the National Australia Bank took the core ledger offline for nightly batch processing. This broke the chain of command because the ATM could no longer talk to the boss. So the system failed over to a redundancy protocol called stand-in processing, or STIP. In this mode, the ATM stops asking for permission and starts making assumptions. And when Dan initiated a transfer from credit to savings, the ATM tried to verify his credit balance. It couldn't because the core was dead, so it timed out and canceled the transaction. Technically, the debit command failed, but the credit command, the part where money is added to a savings, was stored in the local cache before the verification check. It wrote the positive value to his account locally, assuming it would reconcile the negative value later. This is what engineers call a race condition. Dan just withdrew the positive value before the later ever happened. So the next morning, Dan wakes up hungover and with a foggy memory. He remembers the bar, he remembers the machine, and he remembers the canceled message. He reaches into his wallet and finds the cash. But Dan checks his online banking, and the balance says 0. See, when the system wakes up at 8 a.m., it sees the ATM's log saying that it gave money to a certain account, but it can't find the record of where the money came from. The debit packet is missing. Now, a smart system would call that fraud, but this system assumes the error is on their end. So instead of deleting the money immediately, the system enters a pending reconciliation window. It gives the network 24 to 48 hours to find the missing data before it initiates a reversal, taking the money back. Dan didn't know the technical term for this, but he could feel it. He knew that if he just sat there, the bank would eventually figure it out and come for him. So he realized he had to stay one step ahead of the reversal. He couldn't erase the debt, but he figured out he could move it. He created a strategy using 2 different accounts, let's call them Card A and Card B. Here's what he did. On night 1, he uses Card A to execute the glitch. He withdraws, let's say, $1,000. Now the clock starts ticking. He has roughly 24 hours before the reversal hits card A. So on night 2, just before the timer runs out, he introduces card B. He goes back to the ATM at 1 a.m. He uses the same glitch on card B to create a phantom deposit of $1,000. He doesn't withdraw it though. Instead, he transfers that ghost money electronically to card A. Now watch what happens when the bank's computer wakes up. It looks at card A, it sees a valid electronic transfer from card B. It thinks, oh, the money appeared, problem solved, and it marks card A as settled. The system is happy, but Dan has just started a new timer on card B. He was basically playing hot potato with the bank's database. Every night he would shuffle the negative balance from one card to the other, resetting the 24-hour clock just before the alarm went off. But this created a scary problem. Dan wasn't just covering his debt, because that wouldn't be any fun. He was spending the cash. That meant the hole he was digging kept getting deeper every single day. If he stole $5,000 on Monday, he had to glitch $5,000 on Tuesday just to cover Monday's tracks. But if he wanted to spend another $5,000 on Tuesday, he had to glitch $10,000 in total. So the money kept growing every night. If he missed a single 1 a.m. window, or if the ATM was out of order for some reason, the reversal would hit. The whole scheme would unravel and the system would flag him for hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt. But hey, at least he could have fun while the whole scheme was going. Now, a dumb criminal would go out and buy a Ferrari or a mansion, but Dan was smart enough to know that buying a mansion on a bartender's salary is, well, a little suspicious. So he decided to burn the cash on experiences. He hired private jets to fly his friends to tropical islands for lunch. He rented out entire floors of luxury hotels in Melbourne. He would walk into a crowded bar and buy everyone drinks. He told his friends he was an investment banker or a poker pro, and because he was paying off their student loans and buying them French designer suits, they believed him, or at least they pretended to. Dan later described the feeling not as being rich, but having admin privileges on the real world. But there was that nasty catch to the whole thing. Every single night he had to leave his luxury suite, leave the party, and find an ATM on a street corner. He had to stand there out in the cold, pressing buttons and praying the machine didn't eat his card. And he knew that sooner or later, the bank server was gonna catch up. Dan stopped sleeping. He started having nightmares that SWAT teams were rappelling down the side of his hotel. He would be at a dinner party surrounded by friends who thought he was an investment genius, and he would just zone out doing mental math. You know, how much is on card A? When does the reversal hit card B? Did I do the transfer last night? The admin privileges had become a curse. He couldn't stop, or else everything would collapse. And I mean, what was the point of it all if he wasn't having fun? He had lost the ability to enjoy the cash or any of the things he was buying. And then the guilt set in. You know, Dan wasn't a career criminal, he was just a regular guy. And he realized that eventually he would have to call it quits. So in June 2011, Dan just stopped. He didn't go to the ATM at 1 a.m. He didn't shuffle the debt, he just sat in his living room and let the timer run out. At 8 a.m., the National Australia Bank system woke up. It looked for the ghost money from card B. It wasn't there. It looked for the payment on card A. It wasn't there. The pending reconciliation window closed, and for the first time in months, the math reflected reality. Dan had a negative $1.6 million balance. Dan packed a bag, he put on a suit, and he sat by the door waiting for the federal police to kick it down. He waited and waited, but nobody came. See, Dan assumed that stealing $1 million would trigger some big red alert, but the bank simply froze his accounts. They didn't call the cops, they just sent him a letter asking him to please contact the collections department. So Dan did something kind of unheard of. He called the bank to complain that they hadn't arrested him. He realized the bank didn't want a trial, because a trial meant media attention, and then they would have to explain how a drunk bartender stumbled upon a flaw in their ATM system. They preferred just to lose the money rather than face public backlash. So Dan forced their hand. He went on national TV and detailed the exact method of the exploit. Only then, after he exposed them on primetime, did the police knock on his door. In the end, Dan Saunders was charged with 111 counts of fraud and theft, with the total damages being $1.6 million. And with the 111 counts, you might think Dan would be cooked, but He actually only got 1 year. The National Australia Bank just wanted this to fade out of memory. They gave him a slap on the wrist, told him to keep his mouth shut, and hope the world would forget. Dan is out now and he's back to being a normal guy. He's also still a bartender.